Hi there, I'm Damian Wampler, and today we are going to talk about comic books. I'm here at the US Embassy in Moscow at the American Center, and before we get started, I want to say that if you like this video, if you're interested in comics, please hit share so that your friends can check it out. Also, if you like this video, if you like comic books, hit like right away so that we know that you're out there. So I'm the Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer here at the US Embassy, and we're talking about American culture. And usually when you talk about American culture, you have to think, what is quintessentially American? Because the majority of Americans come from somewhere else. We're a nation of immigrants. So if you think pizza, well, that's Italian. You think hamburger, French fries, well, that's German, that's European. So what is America? What is American culture? If you think about it for a second, what might come to your mind right away is some of our music, like jazz, blues, gospel, hip-hop, maybe some of our sports, basketball, American football, baseball, country music, westerns, the cowboy, Hollywood. These are all very American, but don't forget about comic books. Comic books are also an American invention, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So thanks for joining us. We're going to talk about sequential art, comic books, graphic novels, their influence on American history, how they influence Hollywood, and how they came to be. If you have questions, feel free to ask in the comments. At the end of this presentation, I'll be taking your questions, so feel free to ask. Можно спросить по-английски, по-русски, как хотите, мне всё равно. I will be answering everything in English. Hopefully you're all out there studying English and practicing English. So let's talk about comic books for a second. Like I said, comic books are an American art form. They were invented by Americans in the 1920s and 30s, and they became hugely popular in America and spread around the world. But what are comic books? What are comics? Well, comics are sequential art that's put into a book. And so we've got to talk about what is sequential art. Well, what is a sequence? First of all, a sequence is something that goes in order, like the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a sequence of numbers. They go in a certain order. So sequential art is art that goes in a certain order. They're little boxes or squares or cubes of art that are read in a sequence, read in an order. And honestly, America did not invent sequential art. In fact, sequential art has been around for thousands and thousands of years. For example, if you look at cave art, if you look at the art that was drawn on the walls of caves thousands and thousands of years ago, they're drawing their stories in art form. So they're drawing sometimes a hunt, maybe they're showing how they started to hunt an animal, and then later on they talk about, well, they show you how they kill the animal. So this is a language, but there's no words. It's all told in art. So it's possible that cave drawings are the earliest form of sequential art. But after that, you've got other forms of sequential art. For example, this is a Chinese character. It's the character for mountain. And some Chinese characters are actually little pictures of what they're supposed to mean. So if you look at the Chinese character for mountain, it looks like a little mountain, right? It's very easy to tell that this is a mountain. And there are many other characters, Chinese characters, that follow that same formula. For example, horse, it developed from a picture of a horse. And the final Chinese character doesn't look so much like a horse, but if you trace it back to its origins, the Chinese character for horse originally started as a little picture of a horse. I'll give you a couple other examples, like river, sun, and moon. They're all pretty clearly pictures. So it's possible to say that Chinese language, or the Chinese written language, began as a form of sequential art, a series of pictures that were strung together, and then later on, sounds were added to them. There's lots of other examples of pictures transforming into languages or sequential art throughout history. So I'll give you another example. Everybody knows what this is. right? These are Egyptian hieroglyphics, and hieroglyphics are little pictures, but then the pictures go on to tell stories. They have sounds, they have words, but you're really kind of reading sequential art when you're reading Egyptian hieroglyphics. So here's a couple more examples right there. It kind of looks like a comic book already, right? There's other forms of art that copy this in Latin America, like the Mayan and the Incan art. And then if you look at these giant paintings in Italy, each painting is like its own story, and the story has an order to it, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So these paintings and many tapestries from that era are also sequential art. If you look at this door, right, each panel on this door is its own piece of art, and they have to be read in order, and they tell a story. Here's another example. This is a Greek vase, and if you look at it, it's really telling a story with pictures. So anytime you tell a story with pictures, this is called sequential art. And it's a very different art form from a novel, from a poem, a lyric poem, or a static painting. Now, I'm going to show you something that sometimes people think is comic books, but is not. You might be familiar with cartoons that are political cartoons. This political cartoon, it's funny, it tells a story, but it's just one panel. So this is not sequential art. This is a single panel political cartoon. Can anybody guess what maybe the most famous, most well-known piece of sequential art is in the world in a religion? Because there's one piece of religious art that is sequential art that most people in the Western world know. If you can guess, type it into the comments, and we'll see who gets it first. So sequential art dates back thousands and thousands of years. It's nothing new, but what America did was we put the pieces together and created a brand new phenomena that's completely different from the types of sequential art that you've already seen. So has anyone guessed maybe what in religion is the most famous piece of sequential art? No? I would say it's the 12 Stations of the Cross, what we call it in English, the 12 Stations of the Cross, where these 12 little portraits or pictures or sculptures tell about Jesus' death and resurrection, right? Everybody in the Christian and Catholic tradition know it, and that's all sequential art. It's because back at that time, a lot of people couldn't read, so they would need to hear this story or see this story without words, and so it was depicted in sequential art. So let's talk about comic strips for a second, because this is where the American story begins. In America, in the newspaper, of course, in the beginning of any newspaper, we've got news. We've got the most important news of the day. We've got the business, stocks, and then maybe sports, entertainment, cuisine. But in America, at the back of all newspapers, you have something called the funny pages. And the funny pages have been around for a long, long time, about 100 years. And on Sundays, they're color. During the weekdays, the funny pages are in black and white. And there are a lot of famous comic strips that appeared in the funny pages. You might know this one here. This is a big, fat orange cat. He's very, very lazy, and he loves to eat lasagna. His name is Garfield, and he started as a comic strip in the back of the newspaper. So these comic strips, they're very fun, they're very funny, and what would happen is you've read the news, you've read all the boring and depressing stuff, and then you want to kick back and relax a little bit, so you'd open up the funny pages, and you've got all these cartoons right here, so that you can have a little bit of fun. Well, so these were around in the 1920s and 1930s, and then what happened with the newspaper business is that if you missed, let's say, a comic strip, let's say you were reading a comic strip day to day to day, but if you missed one, there was no way to go back and find it. So if you were reading a comic strip that followed along a long story and you couldn't pick up the newspaper that day and you missed it, there was no place you could go to buy an old newspaper and find out what happened. There were some adventures in the comic strips, like The Phantom or Prince Valiant, where the story kept going on for weeks or months or years, but there was no way to read all of these comic strips at once. You had to buy the newspaper every day. But there were some American newspaper entrepreneurs, some owners, who said, you know what we should do? We should go and take all of these comic strips that we printed already in the past, and we should cut them out, and we should lay them out together and create one whole story that people can sit down and read. So they don't have to read the weather and the news, they can just read the comics. And this was a great idea for the comics book, or for the newspaper owners, because they had all these old comic strips laying in their archives that weren't being used. They had been printed once, and then they were just sitting there. So it was very cheap for them to just collect the old comic strips, put them in one book, one newspaper, fold it in half, and then sell it like this. The other good thing about it was, with a big newspaper machine, you often have ink that's on the roll that you need to get rid of. So at the end of the night, you don't want to leave wet ink in your newspaper machine. So they needed to run off the extra ink. So what they did was they took these comic strips like Phantom and Prince Valiant, they assembled them onto its own newspaper, and they ran off the rest of the ink. And then what they did was they stuck it on the newspaper rack. There used to be these spinning racks where you could buy newspapers. And it was an experiment. Would people want to actually go and just read a whole folded up newspaper that's just one comic strip? So they tried it and they stuck it up there. Well, it turns out it was a huge hit. There were some people who didn't want to read the news. They wanted to read these comic strips because they were fun. So they started to sell out of them. They would take the old comic strips and reprint them, but then they ran out of reprints. So that's when they had to begin asking artists to create new comic strips and new characters, not for the newspaper, but specifically to put in something brand new, a brand new project, brand new product called a comic book. So that's what they did. They went to some artists and creators, and they said, Jerry and Joe, can you make something for us that we'll specifically put into this new thing? And so Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster came up with Action Comics #1. It's the first appearance of a character called Superman, who you guys probably all know. And when Joe and Jerry created Superman and put him in Action Comics, they didn't know if it was going to be a huge hit or not, but amazingly enough, it was a massive, massive hit. It was a huge success. So immediately, there was a call to create more. And so right away, the newspapers commissioned another character, and it was Detective Comics. And Bob Kane and Bill Finger created a brand new character that you all know. That's Batman, 1939. So right away, Batman and Superman were a huge hit. And after that, basically comic books were born, and there became just a massive number of characters arriving every week, every month onto the scene. So I'm going to run out of batteries. So very shortly after, you've got characters from Marvel: Spider-Man, Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Daredevil, all these different characters that you guys know and love very well because of the movies that are out right now. So Captain America, of course, is huge. Iron Man is huge. Spider-Man is huge. So all of this came out 1937, 1938, 1939. These characters that you know and love today all were born way back then, almost 100 years ago. So Detective Comics, that's where we get the brand DC, because it's a shortened name, Very straightforward, very simple, detective comics. And then right after that, Marvel came out. And Marvel, as you guys all know, owned the rights to Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man, and a whole bunch of other characters that you see in the movies all the time. Now, in comics, Marvel and DC are what are called the Big Two. These are the big two companies that own a lot of the famous characters that you know. But there are other comic book companies. These aren't the only comic book companies out there. So in the 80s, there were a group of 7 of Marvel's top creators, top artists and writers that were fed up with the Big Two. They were fed up with Marvel. They were upset that they couldn't kill their characters or they couldn't kill the villains. So they just walked out. They just walked right out of Marvel's office and created their own company, and it's called Image. Image has had a couple big hits like Spawn and Witchblade, and there are a bunch of smaller companies who are starting to get into the mainstream. You might know that a movie called Bloodshot just came out. That was also from a small independent comic book publisher, not the Big Two. So, late 1930s, the rise of comic books in America. But what also happened in the late 1930s and 1940s, we have a global conflict, World War II. So comic books spread throughout the world with American soldiers, because as American soldiers went to Europe and the Pacific to fight, they brought their comic books with them. And when the soldier was finished with his comic book, he might hand it to a little kid. So I would say it's been shown that the rise of comics in Europe, and right now comics are really big in France and Belgium, is because our soldiers, American soldiers, were there handing out comic books when they were done with them after the Allied forces liberated those countries. And in the Pacific also, our soldiers were there reading comic books and giving them away. So that covers the 1940s, but the 1950s were a very, very challenging time for the United States. And one thing that's interesting about comics is comics mirror what's happening in American culture at the time. So after the war, there were all different types of comic books out there. There were horror comic books, there were romance comic books, there were thrillers. Some of them had very suggestive content in them. There were lots of murders, sometimes there were drugs, sometimes there was illicit romance and scantily clad women. And America became very conservative in the 1950s. There was something called the Red Scare, where American people and some people in our government were afraid of communism and started labeling people communists. And there were other people who were convinced that comic books and some of these suggestive images in the movie theaters, in novels, and in comics were corrupting our youth and were bad for society. So there were these two different forces working in our culture to suppress some of these liberal or some of these different ideas. And that led to, in comics, something called the Comics Code. So in the 1950s, throughout American culture, there was repression of different ideas. There was anti-communist propaganda that was used for political gain. In the comic books world, what that meant was that all of the romance and all of the thriller, horror, Western, and noir comics, they were all banned. So Marvel and DC were the two big companies. They could no longer make horror comics or these kind of detective comics where there are, like mostly naked women and guns and drugs. All of that was banned through the Comics Code. So there weren't very many options left. I mean, if you can't make comics for adults with these kind of dark images, what can you make? Well, they really could only make superhero comics. That was it. They were only left with superhero comics. So that's why when you think about comic books, you think of superhero comics, but that's only because in 1954 and onward, all the other types of comics in America were banned. They were illegal. You could not make them. So the comic book industry reacted by really making all superhero comics. So these are the reasons, this is the reason why we have so many superheroes in the comic book scene. Now, there were people who didn't agree with this comics code, and there were people who challenged it. Because the comic book code said you cannot have any drugs in your comic books, any drug use. You can't show people using marijuana or cocaine or any of this. But there were some creators who were saying, wait a minute, what if we want to show drugs in a negative light? What if we want to show drug use, but then have a negative effect? And maybe because all of these kids are reading the comics, maybe it will teach kids not to use drugs. And so there was a Spider-Man comic in 1971 that challenged the comic book code. This is the Amazing Spider-Man 96 and 98. And, you know, Spider-Man was very, very popular with kids. And so Marvel Comics decided to make this anti-drug comic. The US Department of Health requested that they make it to teach kids not to use drugs. This is 1971, so there were a lot of problems with young people using drugs at the time. So this was actually a really good idea, but it was against the comic book code. But Marvel did it anyway, and the comic book code could not be enforced, would not be enforced. Nobody wanted to say, hey, Marvel, you can't make an anti-drug comic. And so after that, the comic book code basically went away, and comic book companies started really just making whatever they wanted. So I have some old comics here, like this one. This Flash comic has a little comic book code symbol on it. It's from 1987. But then once you get too much past that, there's no comic book code symbol on the comics anymore. They just did away with it completely. Comics can be a really great teaching tool. So there's a Superman comic that was commissioned by the United Nations that teaches people about landmines. So it's actually Superman and Wonder Woman. There are versions of it in English and Spanish. And as you can see, it teaches young people to be aware of the threat of landmines, because they kill a lot of young people, they kill a lot of people in certain countries after wars. And so this comic was used to teach young people about landmines. So we're going to talk a little bit about how comics are made. Remember, if you have questions about the history or culture of comics, feel free to ask. We can answer them at the end, but I'd be happy to answer any questions right now. So, oh, sure. Sure.
Okay, so what is your favorite comic book genre? Is there a comic book that left a long-lasting impression on you? And what do hardcore comic book aficionados think about manga comics? So 3 questions.
All right.
Just one comic.
So we've got 3 different questions. One is, well, the first one is, what's my favorite comic?
Comic book genre.
Oh, favorite comic book genre. Okay. That's a really good question. One of the challenges for me living outside of the United States is I don't have access to my favorite comic book shops anymore. So I don't go back to America very often. Once every 1 or 2 years I go back. My favorite comic book genre, I think I really like science fiction. I like the fact that with comics you have an unlimited special effects budget, right? You don't need to worry about how much it costs to blow up a spaceship. You can just draw it and do it. So I really like science fiction. The Dark Horse comic book Aliens is kind of what got me into comics in the first place. When I was growing up, Dark Horse bought the rights to Aliens. You probably all know the movies, Alien and Aliens, that are hugely popular. Well, there's a whole bunch of comic books about them, and I think I just like that you can do all of the crazy things that you have in your mind in comic books without worrying about how much money it costs to make. Second question is my favorite.
Is there a comic book that left a long-lasting impression on you?
Comic book that left a long-lasting impression? Yeah, there's a couple sitting right here on my desk, which I'll talk about. Blankets by Craig Thompson really left a long impression on me. Of course, Watchmen is really, really great. It's a groundbreaking graphic novel.
I'm sorry, Damian. So is Adiyala also a comic book?
It's a graphic novel, yes.
Oh.
Yes, yes.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And what else? And I also think March by John Lewis and Nate Powell, which I'll talk about at the end. That one left a really strong impression on me also. And then the last question about hardcore aficionados, what do they think about manga?
Right.
Yeah, this is funny because you've got this kind of mini war between American comics and manga, and they're so different. And of course, manga has translated very quickly and fluidly onto the big screen as anime, whereas comic books have their own cartoons, TV shows, and movies. I don't think there's a conflict, but there are definitely, two different ways of thinking. Some people really love American comic books, Western comic books. Some people really like manga. There's a different way that these two art forms are created. The creative process is completely different. There's a different way that they're sold and read. If you go to, for example, I visit Taiwan fairly often because my wife is from there. There are these manga libraries where because nobody can afford to buy all this manga, so you pay like a monthly fee, and then you can go into these libraries, you can sit and read for hours and hours and hours, whereas comic books, people like to collect them and hold on to the covers. In comic books, often the person the cover is its own piece of art, and it's not drawn by the same person who does the interiors. So the cover is collectible, and the actual physical thing is collectible, which is very different from manga. So they're very, very different. I don't think it's fair to compare them. I think you can love both, but they are very different. So I don't think there's a conflict between the two. You can definitely love manga and American comic books. How are comic books made? Hopefully some of you are interested in making comic books. There are some amazing Russian comic books. I've met a lot of very talented Russian artists who create their own comics, and I've become friends with some of the publishers here in Russia. So you might be interested in making comics. We can talk about it. To make American comic books, you usually have 4 people on the team, at least. Some people, like Craig Thompson, they can make the entire graphic novel themselves. Craig writes the script, he draws all the art, he does the letters. But this is not typical. When you look at an American comic book, there's at least 3 names on it, sometimes 4, sometimes even 5. So in American comic book, you have the writer. And the writer is going to write a script. But a comic book script is very different from a play where you're mostly writing dialogue. A comic book script is not just dialogue. The writer of a comic book is actually giving instructions to the artist, telling them what to draw on the page. So if you look at a comic book, this is a Star Wars comic book, and you see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different panels. A comic book writer actually has to describe each panel and tell the artist what to draw on this panel, what to draw on this panel. So this panel is Darth Vader. So the writer is going to have to write panel 1, head shot, or from the waist up shot of Darth Vader looking at us. Panel 2, image of this general's feet or Darth Vader's feet. So the writer is writing the story arc, they are writing the plot, they're writing the dialogue, but they're also describing every panel. So in a way, a comic book writer is also an artist, because you have to conceptualize and envision the whole finished page before the artist even writes it. In the olden days, before computers, there were a couple other people involved in the process. One person usually did pencils, which is the shapes and the figures, and then another person would do the inks, which means they would take an ink pen and draw in the blacks. Now, penciling and inking are two very different processes. It's a different way of thinking. The person who does the pencils is drawing the outlines. The person who is doing the inks is creating the shadows and putting in the shadows. Usually somebody who is a good penciler is not a good inker, and vice versa. And inking now, with the age of digital, is kind of a lost art. Most people now are drawing their comics digitally, and a lot of people are forgetting about the inks and the shadows, but it's still a very important step. So you have your writer, your penciler, your inker. Sometimes the penciler and inker are the same person. And then you also typically have a different person coming in to do the colors. So color, like the penciling and inking, is such a different way of thinking. It's such a different art form that often you have a separate person putting in the colors. Now, if you're multi-talented and you can do pencils and inks and colors, that's fantastic. There are some people who can do it all, but it's such a different art. The colors and the inks and the pencils are such a different art that it's usually split up. And also, sometimes it's just faster to do the pencils and then pass them off to somebody else. So you've got the writer, penciler, inker, colorist, and oftentimes you have another person. This is called the letterer, the person who puts in the letters or the word balloons or the speech bubbles. And this is a whole art unto itself, because all comics, most comics, have word balloons, and someone's got to go in and put them in. So if you look at this old Indiana Jones comic, every page has letters, and this is kind of like graphic design. It's a completely separate art form from the lettering, from the penciling and the inking and the coloring, and you need to have somebody go in and do that. Most people don't remember the letters. Most people don't put down a comic book and say, wow, the letters are really good. But if the letters are bad, you will notice. That's one thing. And also, when the letters are really good, it enhances the story. So if somebody is screaming, you're going to have a separate type of word balloon. If someone is whispering, the word balloon's going to be maybe very small, or maybe it'll be light gray. So if you love a comic and enjoy it, you're usually partly enjoying it because the letters were done well. Somebody asked about genres. So in comics, now that we don't have the comics code, there are hundreds and hundreds of different types of genres. So there's not just superhero comics anymore. There is every different kind of genre that you can think of. So there's fiction and nonfiction, there's science fiction, there's westerns, there's historical fiction, there are mysteries, horror, drama, basically everything you can think of. There's narrative, personal narratives, there's memoirs, there's journalists who use comic books also. There are so many different ways you can use sequential art and so many different types of genres that it's basically now you can think of sequential art as being able to be used for anything. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Back to March, most of you probably are familiar with the very famous I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Washington, D.C., but he was just one of a number of people who spoke that day as part of the civil rights movement. And one of the people who spoke that day is John Lewis. And now he is a representative